evening, everyone. We will call the October meeting of the Board of Education's Legislation and Advocacy Committee to order. Tonight is a special meeting of our group, which we've been meeting for the last couple of months. Just to sort of recap, we have identified 3 legislative priorities that we will ask the Board of Education to adopt in addition to their legislative platform, which we'll ask them in November to consider. We wanted to dedicate one meeting this month to one of our legislative priorities, and that is combating the effects of trauma in our schools. As has kind of been our practice, this is just going to be sort of an informal conversation. And to that end, we've invited some special guests in addition to our normal committee members. So if you wouldn't mind, we'll go around the room and introduce ourselves as a way of taking roll and just tell us who you are and what your position is. Start with you, Dr. Brown.
Good evening, Dr. Michael Brown, Deputy Superintendent of Student Support Services of the St. Louis Public Schools.
Good evening, I'm Megan Marietta. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I manage the social workers for St. Louis Public Schools, as well as the embedded clinicians that we have on staff, and also lead the district's work to become trauma informed.
Press the button.
Hi, I'm Brenda Smith. I'm the principal of Vashon High School.
Hi, I'm Alicia Sanye. I'm a member of the Board of Education.
Good evening. I'm Emily Kelso. I'm a parent in St. Louis Public Schools. I'm also the chair of the Parent Action Council.
Good evening, Calvin Adams, Superintendent, St. Louis Public School.
Dr. Smith.
Dr. Marion Smith Jr., Deputy Superintendent of Academics.
Lori Willis, Deputy Superintendent for Institutional Advancement.
Byron Clemens with AFT St. Louis.
Good evening. My name is Isaac Pollock. I'm an Associate Superintendent with the district, and I am also a parent for the district.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Nicole Williams. I serve as the Chief of Staff here in the St. Louis Public Schools.
And over in the corner, they do not have microphones because they are here for moral support. We have representatives from the St. Louis Public Schools Foundation. So we have Bridget Jones, who's the president and the CEO. We have Kaylee Lawrence, who is a program director. We have Constance Rush, who is a member of their board of directors. And we have Jackie Randolph, who's also a member of their board of directors. So thank you all for coming so much for supporting this important topic. So like I said, I want to make this sort of an informal roundtable. The purpose of this is we've identified asking the legislature to provide line item funding to support our efforts to combat trauma in schools. In addition to asking the legislature for that specific request, we also want to use this opportunity to advocate in our community for what trauma has impacts our students. So to that end, we want to turn it over to the people that face us on the front line. So Dr. Brown, Ms. Marietta, Dr. Smith, I'll turn it over to you. Whoever would like to start, just sort of discuss about what are some of the things that we do, where you think a greater impact could be had. And also if you could just even sort of explain what trauma means in our student population and along with our staff and the families that we also serve.
All right, well, good evening again. Just to provide some background information around trauma-informed care, what does it mean and how has it shown up in our district? When we look at what does trauma mean, we need to make sure that we are using an individualized definition of that word. A traumatic event or an experience is really left up to the individual who is experiencing or witnessing that event. Something that is traumatic to one person might not be to another, because we all have different windows of tolerance. We all have different coping strategies. And we also know that trauma has a compounded effect. And so also depending on what one's history is, could also determine how an event could cause them to respond and changes in behaviors, thoughts, and emotions. And so it could be that it is a personal event, something that happens solely to me or something that's happening in our family. It could also be a shared event, something that's happening in the community, in our schools community, in our neighborhood communities, in St. Louis as a whole. And so it's also important to realize that although there are individual and shared experiences, we also still come with all of our strengths to the table. And it's important to really focus on those strengths. In 2010, when I came to the district, I began talking with Dr. Adams then about trauma-informed schools and what does that look like and what would we need to do to create that type of environment here in St. Louis Public Schools. And that's what really started our work with professional development, mainly focused for the social workers in the district on how to respond. How do we provide support and intervention? From there, we continue to grow that work with professional development being offered to all of our schools, a Trauma 101, going through a Trauma 101 with our executive leadership team. And as that work developed, we were finally prepared in 2014 to apply for some federal funding to support the work. We received that funding in 2016 and then also received additional local funding from the Missouri Foundation for Health in partnership with the St. Louis Public Schools Foundation to also provide that work through a different partner, Alive and Well. Our other partner was Children's Advocacy Services of Greater St. Louis. And what we were able to do is work with cohorts of schools and building leaders on creating trauma-informed practices within their school buildings. So providing them professional development, coaching, consultation, funds to support implementation projects. And as both of those two projects progressed through the next 5 years, we were also really focused on sustainability. We knew that at some point the funding stream would end, and what were we going to be left doing? And so we have been working on professional development for social workers within the district so that they can continue that coaching and consultation with schools. We just launched 15 new trauma teams. 12 are school-based teams across the district, all grade levels and throughout the city. And then also 3 district departments have signed on for that work as well this year. In conjunction with that work, we've also found funding streams to continue employing trauma-informed therapists. Initially, they were supported by grant funding, and we have been able to partner again with the foundation to continue to have clinicians on board, as well as to even expand to include more clinicians as part of SLPS staff. And so that in a nutshell is kind of how we've gotten to where we are right now. And hopefully we can continue the conversation of how is this work going to continue within SLPS?
Thanks. I do have some questions, but I'll come back to you. Dr. Smith, I had talked to you previously, and you had sort of painted a vivid picture of what trauma looks like in schools when the kids come in. Would you mind sharing that with us?
So I had a really interesting conversations with some students about masks. We're in a pandemic and we're talking about, why is it so hard for you to keep your mask on? Don't you understand what's happening? And one of the kids said, do you understand what happens to us every day? And I said, explain it. And he said, Ms. Smith, I've lost more people to gun violence in the street than I have to the corona. And that just put it really, really different. It kind of made me look at the situation a lot different. It isn't something that is important to them because they are faced with violence on a regular basis. And so when I think about my students, the number of them who just need that extra time and support for the different forms of trauma that they experience on a day-to-day basis. We have a large population of our students who have witnessed actual murders happening. They've witnessed the violence. They are without one of their parents, if not both. They have witnessed friends be murdered. And so that comes to school in a way that our students need extra attention. They need extra conversation. If my social worker could be here today, she would just say how much time she spends on anxiety and triggers that our kids have from what they experience and what they deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so for our teachers, we have had, some training with Alive and Well. And it's a constant conversation about looking at those triggers and not responding necessarily in the way that you think, but really digging deep and figuring out what's happening. If you ever are visiting Michelle, you'll notice like we spend a large amount of time just counseling our students and being an ear for them so that they can let out some of those experiences or some of those feelings and emotions that they have. But what we find out is it's a full-time job. Right now, we have one counselor that comes on Tuesday and sees 6 kids. And most of those kids are students who have witnessed a parent either be murdered or have a parent that was deceased in a very, very traumatic way. And so I think about 6 kids in a building of 600 kids and how many of them like truly need those services. I also think about my staff when dealing with students that experience those type of things. Everyone doesn't have the time to say, hey, why don't you have on a mask? To the teacher, you don't have on a mask, and that's a threat to my classroom. So recognizing that more training is needed so that we don't respond in a way that triggers whatever the emotion that the students is feeling is extremely important. And we signed up this year with Ms. Megan Marietta and her team to just become better so that we can support our students who walk through this life every single day.
And thank you. I guess one of my first questions, I'll open it up and please, anybody else who has questions or comments, please jump in. I don't ever mean to dominate this conversation. But how has the pandemic affected your ability to provide trauma-informed care? How's it affected the ability of outside partners to assist us, those counselors to come in? If you can sort of speak to that.
Yeah, so, initially when the pandemic hit March of 2020, our students and families were all of a sudden thrusted back home, and we very quickly had to shift. We had therapeutic services in place. They were happening in the building, but now no one's in the building. What do we do? So very quickly had to shift to telehealth services. And many of our partners were able to shift right along with it. There are certain laws and protections that districts are responsible for putting in place surrounding student and staff contact over platforms such as Zoom or Teams, even text, cell phones. And so while protecting students in that space as well, we were able to move many of our partners to telehealth services. And that continued well through last year as well. But we have certainly faced challenges last year with students being in pods and really restricting movement between pods, facilitating small groups with students focused on social emotional skill building wasn't that easy. And obviously student attendance has impacted the children being able to access services on a weekly basis. This year, as we have, embraced and embarked another year that's looked like no other, staff are being asked to fill in and wear hats that they don't traditionally, which then also can shift focus away from responsibilities or other things that we would like to be doing. But obviously, having our students in class with someone who cares about them and is teaching them is important as well. And so we've been trying to meet all of these needs and balance them out. So we've definitely seen that shift due to the pandemic. We've also seen, though, that our students are presenting in a way that I wouldn't say it's unlike ever before. I would just say it's more exasperated now. The violence was before the pandemic. Student homelessness was before the pandemic. Families being isolated, not having access to resources or supports, all of that was in existence before COVID. COVID has just really exacerbated that for many of our families. And for many of our students, they have been isolated from peers or even from family. And so helping them readjust to socializing with peers, helping them readjust to school culture has been another avenue that staff have had to go down before that prior to the pandemic, we really didn't have to deal with so much.
Dr. Smith.
And I'll just add to everything Megan just said. One of the things is trust. And so when you are a student and you are very transient, people come in and out of your life, it's really, really hard to even want to do a telecommunications or do virtual because that trust is not built. They can't see you in person. They can't feel how genuine you are. And so we ran into, with the pandemic, just a lot of issues where we had some groups forming and we had some support services. Students were like, nope, we don't want to do it. I don't know this person. I don't trust this person. And so that definitely hindered some of the support services that we had in place for our students while in the pandemic.
And to add, even shifting from students, we've had to really care about our staff. Ms. Marietta and her team has employed the resilient and coping training for administrators, which was a shift from us as student support services. We had to shift to staff. And so that was a huge shift for us during the pandemic to really concentrate on staff. So the resilient and coping training that was provided for administrators was really appreciated by them. So that was another shift that we had to make during that time.
And bridging off of what Principal Smith said, building that trust with staff as well was just as key for us. Having staff understand that we truly do care about your well-being. That is the message that we want staff to understand, that this isn't just a one-off event, that this really is the approach and the lens that we want to utilize, that we understand that staff have to be well in order to do well. And the reality is that all of the traumas that we talked about that impact our students and families, all of those traumas also potentially impact our staff as well, not just from a vicarious trauma standpoint or a secondary trauma standpoint, but that they are living those experiences themselves. And so how do we support them? How do we provide intervention and support so that they can show up in this space ready to meet the students and meet their needs?
And how do we support them? I mean, what's the answer? What do we need to do better? What would, funding source? How could we use that to support staff? And maybe that's a rhetorical question. We come back to it.
Matt,
Yes, ma'am.
I
Ms.
had-
Cousins.
I had a
Welcome.
question. Thank you. You were saying the funding came in 2014 and 2017, and I know a lot is happening with the pandemic, but it seems like somewhat we've gradually opened back up in a sense. And I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying, especially on the trauma side. At one point, we had 15 trauma teams. My question is, now that we're in this space that we're in and the kids are actually back at school, and I think I missed it, but are you actually getting resources coming in, helping in the level that it used to be? I know it can't be on the scale that it was before the pandemic, but are you still working with these entities that are able to come? Because what you're saying to me is you have one person coming in on Tuesday to service 6 kids. And I've been in that space. And unfortunately, you're really not making much of an impact with 6 kids as opposed to 600, because I'm sure out of your 600, you probably got 150 that are facing all of this. So where are we in being able to open back up and bring in outside resources to come in and not only assist the students, but the staff as well?
So I think we're in a space now where some people are still hesitant to come in. And so we are able to, send in information and, make some of these support people come back in as essential visitors. What I have found, though, is there is some hesitation on their part due to the pandemic. And so it's not as readily available as it was pre-pandemic. I do believe we also got a lot of support from the foundation. And one of the things they were able to do is give us funds to create kind of like an incentive program. Because a lot of times I'm coming to school and I'm having all these issues, and I'm facing this trauma, and then I go to a teacher and she has no pencil. And I get in trouble because I don't have a pencil. The teacher doesn't have one. And so being able to provide services where now students can come in the building, say, hey, I'm having a really bad day, and there's somebody there that can help that student out. Is it food? We can get that. Is it clothing need? We can get that using funds and support from the St. Louis Foundation. And also from our full service coordinator. She's done a great job of providing for some of those basic needs. We have a food pantry now that is absolutely amazing, that parents utilize on a regular basis. So those type of supports, yes. We're still missing a lot of the therapeutic supports that I think need to be there every day, not just on a Tuesday, and then available, especially when we talk about staff. The number of staff that I've had break down this year, they need somebody, or they need the opportunity to be able to talk and discuss those things as well.
So yes, we are open. We are open back up to our behavioral health partners, and we always have been. So they have been allowed in our buildings from the first day last school year. It is more so a matter, like Principal Smith said, that some of our partners are still hesitant to come into the building and are continuing to offer virtual services. But it is also the reality that agencies are having a difficult time hiring staff. And so the agency that's Safe Connections that's in their building, I reached out to them last week saying, is there any way we could at least have one more day at Bashan? And I heard back late Friday, we just don't have anybody else to provide. And we're running into that, not just with Safe Connections, but through another partnership through the Little Bit. It's the same story, even here within SLPS, to be able to fulfill, therapeutic vacancies has been a challenge. And so what we have been doing is looking at, well, what can we do in-house? What are the trainings that we can do? What are the ways that we can have social workers step up to the plate in a way that maybe they haven't before? And so she's talked about her social worker. Dr. Brown and I talked about this last week, and his question is one more clinician enough? No, it's not. But even if it was 6 more kids, that's still 6 better than the week before, right? And so we are continuing to always assess where our service is being utilized. If they're being underutilized in a building, can we shift and reallocate? So all of that work's being done right now, but then also continuing to train social workers and counselors in social and emotional learning, different therapeutic modalities that the social worker can use either individually or group. So all of our professional development has really been focused around building the toolbox of the social workers so that we can begin to fill some of these gaps in service. And we'll continue to refer students and families to community-based services as well. But yes, we could always use more therapeutic providers within the building. We're also continually making opportunities available to the principals and to school-based staff. If a community partner agency reaches out about providing services, we want to know what is their capacity for adding that service in their building. How can we connect students to services directly in the building? So it's something that we're daily working on.
So while the initial part of the conversation has been focused on students and staff, talk to us a little bit about parents in terms of what you are seeing as it relates to the relationships with the school and parents or caregivers in terms of how they're responding to the notion of trauma, especially through the pandemic.
So I'll answer for our parents, need is much greater. And the need could be like, hey, Ms. Smith, I don't know how to support my child. Or the need is, Ms. Smith, I've lost my job and you're talking about uniforms. I can't go get the khakis. Like I said, with our full service program, our shelves can't stay stocked enough because parents are coming on a regular basis. I'm also hearing that there's a need for students to work. So the conversation is like, hey, Ms. Smith, I know y'all back in person, but I need him to leave this time because he has to go to work. I lost my job. And so there's just a major need for support and resources when it comes to our families.
I had a question, and I guess this will mainly be for you, Dr. Smith. Have you guys received the list of services to choose from the ESSER funds? Okay, I had a question, but I'll have to wait because I was just curious if you had seen that, what you thought of some of those options, but okay.
I'd like to say that we had a really good experience partnering up with St. Louis Public Schools and doing phone banking, individual phone calls. We first found calling our own members before they came back to school, just checking in and seeing how they were doing. It was a big relief for them that somebody cared, and we found it was a new communication tool for us that was underutilized. And instead of just sending out a one-way communication or email or social media, trying to rely on that, it really seemed to help. And that might be one of the things we could do on an individual school basis to reach out to parents, because both of those events that we had recently were very well attended.
And it made me think of something. One of the positive things that has come out of the pandemic is the communication with parents. Because we can hold virtual meetings, because we can send out mass emails, and we have correct phone numbers, because we had to get correct phone numbers to pick up technology. We find ourselves in communication with parents so much more. Even tonight, we're having parent-teacher conferences, and the sign up is greater than we ever had in person. And so the pandemic has allowed us to contact our parents in a different way, and in a way that is more available to them.
If I could, I just want to respond a little bit to the idea of how the pandemic specifically has shaped parent attitudes. I want to echo Ms. Smith's comments about parents needing support in this way as well. It's one thing to take yourself through a global event like a pandemic. It's another thing to navigate your child through a pandemic with the situation shifting constantly, wondering, are they going to be okay? If you have a child that's under the age of 12, they're not able to be vaccinated yet. It's a really scary, scary thing. And I've been through training with Alive and Well through my regular work. So I have a little bit of a background in what Ms. Marietta was talking about with the idea of how trauma manifests. And I think it's something that I've noticed in myself, and I'm sure I've seen with other parents as well, is that they are also experiencing trauma. And so what we're trying to do at the Parent Action Council, and this is a chance to plug our meeting tomorrow, if you want to participate in our virtual meeting, you can email parentactioncouncil@gmail.com for the link. But we are going to be spending our meeting time tomorrow talking about mental health support for children and also just for families in general, because parents also have a great need to be supported and be met with their own traumas at this moment, which are, compounded by things like losing a job, compounded by things like witnessing or experiencing violence, compounded again by fear for your child. Are they okay? Are they safe? Are they healthy? Are they going to be all right if I send them into this school? Is this the right thing to do? Parents every day are having that conversations with each other and with themselves. And it's something that I think this district can certainly help with, which is supporting the parents who are in need. And so the first step could be coming to the PAC meeting tomorrow and starting to have that conversation about some of those resources and how we can support the parent community in that.
And another, one of the things that, especially like we're working with what we call our students in transition population, and working with the city to provide services for those individuals, free legal services. Our student in transition office is working with to try to ease some of those woes of the parents. And also, as we step back in, as Ms. Smith mentioned, we're expanding or looking at our full service programs, as well as our programs within our elementary schools, our Little Bit Foundations, National Council of Jewish Women, who provide a lot of items that students were not afforded over the last year. Pretty much all of our elementary schools, except for maybe 4 or 5, have closets. Many of them have pantries. We also have our full service programs that provide meals. I mean, really good meals for parents. Probably over 20,000 in the last year to parents. So we're doing that. But in addition to that, Ms. Marietta, we just spoke today about continuing or revisiting our parent workshops, which we have trauma workshops for our parents on Saturdays. And so I'll let her speak to that.
We have been hosting a caregiver workshop that's 4 series. We do it on one Saturday, and that way if folks have been once, they can come back again and receive new information, new support. And we'll be revisiting hosting those workshops in person. We've partnered with our Family and Community Engagement Department, and we'll be incorporating the PAC. We actually just had a meeting about it today. And so Emily, you are on my list of folks to connect with next week, which is great timing, because we do want this to be an event for caregivers, and we are looking at expanding it beyond just the traditional trauma-informed workshop to include additional workshops and possibly direct services, such as group facilitation around resilience and coping that parents and caregivers could receive that day. And then also, we received funding through MHB last school year for 30 social workers to participate in comprehensive grief training. And this year received additional money from MHB to be able to offer those services. And so again, today met to discuss implementing comprehensive grief groups for the entire family, potentially looking at 2 sites, one on north side, one on the south side. That would be in the evening. Again, also partnering with our Family and Community Engagement Department so that we would be able to offer childcare for any children who are not age appropriate for group, a family meal, maybe some additional resources and psychoeducation during that meal, but then the children who are age appropriate for counseling and their caregiver would then go and receive age appropriate grief group. And we've really partnered as well with Assistance League this year. They've also been a really big supporter around our grief work. They've provided us grief books to have at all of the Assistance League partnership schools, some Zenimals, which are just these little sleep machines that lead students through meditation, just calming, really great for students to use with anxiety. I shared one with a staff member who was struggling, and they said it worked wonders. And so not forgetting that what works for our students and families can also work for our staff. And so it's just another way to create that lens for them and to provide those additional supports.
I have to say, we know from Maslow, these are not niceties. These are not icing on the cake. We have to start meeting those needs first within the community, not individual people, individual families. We're not little bubbles out there isolated. Sometimes people, especially legislatively, don't understand that. They think it's only about arithmetic. And we have to, I think it's important for us to project that communication out to the public. And part of that for us, I hope we can expand full service community schools. And I also would suggest we try and have a counselor, a nurse, and a social worker full-time in every site. But in order to keep my family in a good place, I'm going to have to leave a little early. I talked to Mr. Davis earlier about that. And I hope everybody understands that I have to do that. Thank you so much.
Dr. Pollack. Oh, sorry.
I just have a question? How you were saying on the caregivers workshops, and that really sounds like a huge need. How has the turnout been for that? How have you seen a lot of people come out on Saturdays? You know, some of the families come out to support that, or do you see that that's really something that we probably can kind of push to do more?
Sorry, we haven't hosted one of the workshops since the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we were roughly seeing anywhere from about 110 to 150 caregivers in attendance, which is great, but I know we can do more. So being very active in terms of making sure that families are aware of the information, making sure that we're sending home notification in different languages. We do have interpreters available for that event as well. And so just making sure that the word is out there through social media, but like was said before, through those personal phone calls home. Hey, I know that you all have been struggling, or I know that this has been going on. Are you interested in this Saturday workshop? This is also something that we hope to be able to do on a monthly basis instead of just once in the fall and once in the spring. And the content we hope will change every week. That way folks will want to come back each time.
Thank you for sharing everything that you've shared, and also for all the support that you're giving to schools, and also for being in schools. And a special thank you to Brenda for being in schools and supporting schools from the inside. So I guess my question, I have two questions. One is, I think about everything that we're talking about tonight is a lot of shouldering of responsibility. And it's a lot of shouldering of responsibility. You know, we've been in schools the past few days on this ambassador program. And it's a lot of shouldering of responsibility on leaders and teachers who are already shouldering a lot of responsibility and undergoing their own trauma and their own secondary trauma. And then I think about, you know, what other governmental partners might we share this load with? And how could we track back towards some sense or some semblance of a baseline? You know, it makes sense that we're in a place where we have to provide and we can provide, but you know, in this model, is it, you know, how can we bring people along with us as we set an example of doing whatever must be done for kids, but like, how do we get other folks to step up and step in as well? And I guess I'm just thinking of that as like, this is my first night here, but as a legislative committee, if it seems like the point is to, you know, this is a legislative question, a question around, you know, how is the city government structured and supportive of this, and on a funding side, how does the state funding formula identify this additional need that is served by SLPS and therefore funds for it? And I know the answer to that, which is it doesn't, but I just wanted to point that out.
So I kind of had two questions related to that. So I'm just going to piggyback on what Dr. Pollack said. First of all, you know, Dr. Brown, you had mentioned students in transition. That's a good example. That is something where there's a system set up so we can quantify how many students we have. We have other categories that the state or the federal government have a mechanism set up so we can classify students who have additional needs that need to be met. And oftentimes there is a funding mechanism for that. In terms of students affected by trauma, is there any way that we can quantify it? I mean, Dr. Smith has been, you know, very kind to sort of step up and be a representative, but it's not just her school. It's not just one or two kids. Do we know how many it is? Do we know how many schools it is? Is there a way to quantify it? And how then, you know, do we make sure that we have the resources appropriate to handle that amount? Because it seems overwhelming to me.
So no, there is no simple way to quantify it. We can look at already existing data. So we can look at the data of the number of children who were the alleged victims of a child abuse and neglect report for St. Louis City. We can look at the number of children who are in foster care in St. Louis City. We can look at crime data. We also are now partnering with MHB and the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department on a Handle with Care program, which if children are at the scene that is potentially traumatic, we receive notification of that. We can look at our suicide risk assessment data. We can look at our harm to others risk assessment data. We can look at the number of children who are flagged as students in transition or unaccompanied youth. We can look at all of those sources of data. We can even look at student self-report, but short of us administering a universal screener to all students on what I would say a fairly regular basis, there's no way to actually capture it in the moment. It would also really rely on the child to be able to self-report and disclose that, yes, I've experienced a trauma. So no, but when you ask about the number of schools, I can safely tell you it's every single school. And if I can safely tell you that it's more than a handful, it's more than 2 handfuls in every building. So is it overwhelming? Absolutely. It is absolutely overwhelming. I just came back from a 2-day conference, and the biggest takeaway for me from the entire 2 days was that three-step process. We have to build it, we have to support it, and then we have to monitor it. And so we've been doing a lot of this work at the student support services level with schools on board and their teams on board. And we've really been pushing this work out. But we also need to work as a district, and we've talked about this coherence and cohesion and breaking out of silos. And those conversations have started. So as all of the negative things that have come from the pandemic, there have been some shining things like parent communication, caregiver communication. I also see, though, that we are talking about trauma in a way that we really never have. We've talked about it, but it was always kind of like it's everyone else. It's not me. And now we are talking about it from the lens of it's me, it's you, it's all of us. There's the shared experience that no one's been immune to, which has really allowed us to talk in ways that we haven't before. And so connections and working across departments, working across projects, even, like tying the dots of all of this work is connected. That's happening. And so I'm starting to see how we're going to build it in as a district, which for me makes it feel less overwhelming. It makes me feel like that together with all of us, we can make it happen.
And so,
Go ahead. I just want to thank you for that. And I just want to add, in addition to that coherence that we need from a district level, the purpose and the intent of this committee is to make coherence, both with the Board of Education, but also with our state and local legislators. So, I think this is the first of many conversations we're going to have on this topic. Sorry, Dr. Brown. Go ahead. No? Okay. And sort of piggyback on the second point for Dr. Pollack in terms of legislation, both part of this is the advocacy part. I was talking earlier that, nobody likes to talk about violence that our children are experiencing. It's painful. It's overwhelming as a city. We're not talking one or two isolated incidents. It's a daily basis, and it's been going on for years, and there doesn't seem to be any time that it's going to slow down or stop. But we have to talk about it because we take it all on, both as people who, adults who are working in this district, but our families and our children. And if Dr. Roberts were here, I would give her, she would probably talk about our main moral imperative as a school district is closing that achievement gap. But it's never going to happen if our kids are experiencing this. And Dr. Smith, you can, I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that too, about the difficulty of just getting down to our first and fundamental role as educators when we have to deal with the effects of trauma.
So I've been dealing with a family for about a week now. Mom has had a 15-year-old son that was murdered this summer. Her high school son is a senior and he goes to our school. Mom came to the school today recognizing that some information about the case had been leaked. And as she's talking to me about her son graduating, she begins shaking. She's terrified. I'm wondering what happened. And so I'm walking, I have her walk with me around the parking lot. We're just walking and talking. And to hear this parent say, I've only wanted my son to graduate. I've already lost one, and now I fear for another one. And that was the conversation this morning. But I think of how many conversations like that I've had this year. I don't feel it's safe for my child to come to school. Somebody knows they're there. They witnessed something. They were around something. It is a conversation that we're having on a weekly basis, where now it is hindering academics because parents are saying, Ms. Smith, I know he has to graduate, but I got to keep him at home because somebody's looking for him. I have to keep him at home because it's not safe on his bus stop. It has become a regular part of conversations with parents. So it's myself, it's my social worker, it's my AP. We're honestly engaged in these type of conversations just as much right now as we're engaged in academics. Just as many observations as I've had this week, I've had parent meetings about this type of trauma and violence.
To pivot then towards the legislation, sort of the question Dr. Pollack asked is what do our state legislators do? And I know, Ms. Marietta, you can talk a little bit about the Missouri model for trauma. And I'm going to sort of forecast my ultimate question. If you can sort of explain what that is, because there was a bill a few years ago, SB 638, that did establish the Missouri model for trauma-informed care. And I know you're still on that advisory committee. But at the same time, when I look through that, the regulations implementing that are very clear. There's no funding attached to this. There's no additional resources from the state to support this. This is on the principals, teachers, the social workers to absorb this Missouri model and implement it. So that's sort of a leading question for you to talk about that.
Well, I want to start off by saying that trauma-informed care shouldn't be thought of as something additional we have to do. It should really just be thought of, that's just how we do the things that we do already. And so it's about that lens shift. It's not about having to have 5 extra meetings or about having to know every student's trauma history. It's about saying that this is the approach, this is the community of care that we are going to cultivate in this building. This is how we are going to approach all staff, all students, and all caregivers, whether a trauma history is present or not. And so I think that, yes, professional development is extra. And yes, certainly sitting down with a family, and Miss Smith may have walked around the parking lot today, but I guarantee you last week she was out at a child's home. And I guarantee you the week before that, it was probably 2 or 3 more. And so it absolutely does. Trauma in and of itself does take away from what we are doing in terms of instruction, but in terms of staff feeling like it's one more thing added to their plate. Hopefully we can change that to us to begin to see that it is really about a lens shift. The Missouri model for trauma-informed schools was created in response to this state statute that comes out, or this bill that came out around trauma-informed schools, and what does it look like? Alive and Well convened an educational leaders work group. Many folks from across the region, not just St. Louis, convened for many, many, many months to create, well, what do trauma-informed schools look like? And how do we know if a school is trauma-informed? And what we really wanted to stay away from is this web of getting into, okay, we did that, check. Okay, we did that, check. Now can we have our banner and say that we're trauma-informed? Because that's not how trauma-informed care works. Trauma-informed care work is really never over. You may have all of your staff trained and utilizing that lens, and then next year a new staff member joins your team, and you have to reteach them. You have to get them up to speed. So it's never really over. And there are so many different areas. When you look at that Missouri model for trauma-informed care, it identifies 12 different indicators that if you are working to become trauma-informed, you could look at and say, well, how are we doing on that indicator? So it ranges from staff wellness and professional development to student discipline to creating space for caregiver and student voice, all the way down to what are our policies and protocols? What does our code of conduct look like? And it gives a slight indication of if these are the practices that you're engaging in, maybe you're just at the stage of being trauma sensitive on this indicator. But maybe if you're doing all of these things, if these are the practices, if this is your policy, well, yes, you might be trauma informed on this indicator. So it gives schools some sort of direction of what can we be doing? What does it look like? And I know Dr. Adams always asks me, well, what is it exactly? And I tell him it's all of the things. It's the really big things that we do, but it's also those small things every single day. How do we welcome students into our building every day? How does Dr. Adams send out communication to staff? All of those things are what lend to a trauma-informed community. And that's what I'm shifting my word to. Instead of trauma-informed schools, I'm saying trauma-informed community now. That's another thing I learned this past week, because it is about our entire community. It's not just about Miss Smith's school. It's about SLPS as a whole. Are we a trauma-informed community supporting her in this work as well?
Dr. Pollack.
I think that's super, super helpful, because I think that one of the things that's so hard in education is the specificity of language. And so we have a program that we've used before also called Shut It Down. And there's a difference between Shut It Down's program and Alive and Well. Could you help me understand, or could you, I know it's different, but like I have a hard time explaining how to.
So, yes, so Shut It Down, all utilize a trauma-informed approach, but all of the partners that we have worked with, and I would say that the three primary partners that we've had in this trauma space have been Children's Advocacy Services of Greater St. Louis, Alive and Well, and Shut It Down. And really, in the structure of how they do that work. So their curriculum is slightly different. What's important to note is that all three target staff as where the work begins, which is interesting. When we first got the first federal grant in 2016, and I was talking with principals about do you want to be a part of this? I was so excited. Like, hey, come join me in this work. And they would say, but what are you doing for the kids? There's nothing in what you just told me that's directly related to the kids. I know it's all done through the adults, right? It's about changing mindsets and hearts of the adults that work with our children. And then what gets to happen is that all of our children get to benefit, not just some, not just 6 on a Tuesday, but if we can change the mindset and the hearts of all of our staff, then all of our students and caregivers get to benefit from it.
And so, thank you. And so I think there's a differentiation between, one, services for students who've experienced trauma, which costs money. 2, treating kids in a way that recognizes that they've experienced trauma, which is a lens. And that takes professional development and conversations and hiring practices. 3, systems to protect our students from experiencing further trauma. And that goes to, Brenda, what you were saying about security or about, building communication systems or whatever it is, which may or may not cost money. So it's like laying all those out so that when we go to legislators or go to even within the district, when we start to say, are you a trauma-informed program? It's like, well, let's break that down. Are you providing services for kids? Are your teachers treating kids in a way that is actually respecting the trauma that they've experienced and honoring that? Are you working proactively to establish systems to keep them safe from further trauma? It's like almost like a 4 or 5 point system.
You did a great job summarizing all of that and really identifying that there are different branches with a different focus of the intervention. And it's really important to note that. So you did a great job summarizing it all together.
I think the thing we probably need to look at as well, especially with Dr. Pollack talking about the legislation, you were saying the board bill, what was the House bill, whatever the number was. So the SB, whatever that is, I think it's kind of looking at how do we perfect, or as the legislative committee, the role we will play and how will we work to try to amend that to lay out pretty much what Dr. Pollack is saying to ensure that all those areas are actually being covered. The only thing I disagree with Dr. Pollack on is everything is going to take money in some sense, to ensure that the community as a whole is a trauma-enforced community or what have you, and those skills are being disseminated across the board on all different levels. So probably from the question that I'm hearing him ask and kind of where we would be sitting, our role would be, how do we look at that bill or that House bill or whatever and say, this is what we're asking the legislator to help and support in regards to the trauma that our city is actually facing, and how we can help them perfect that bill.
And I do think we're joined by Mr. Carroll. Mr. Carroll, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Steve, thanks for jumping on. I know you've had a busy day and you missed part of our conversation, but is there anything you can think of to add, even though you weren't part of the conversation, but anything off the top of the head from what we've talked about previously?
I'm sorry, Matt, I just jumped on here about 5 to 10 minutes ago, actually 5. Were they discussing a certain proposal that's before the legislature or that has been in the past? Is there a bill number that I missed?
We were talking about a previous bill that did pass, Senate Bill 638 a few years ago, and that established the Missouri model for trauma-informed care, which DESE then went and implemented. You know, one of the things is, you know, if you look at that model, it does create a very robust framework in terms of how you sort of grade your district, I would say, in implementing these programs. But it didn't attach any funding to it or additional resources to help a district implement that model. And so that was just sort of an example of what legislation does exist on this, and it seems pretty scarce.
Well, I think what we really need is just a line item funding measure in House Bill 2 to provide some funding for the trauma and for these students who have been victims or witnessed violence actually in the district. I think I put that in one of my PowerPoints that I sent to you as possible things to put in our legislative platform. I can tell you that the cooperating school districts of Greater Kansas City, which also includes Kansas City, adopted that very line item in asking for funding for this. So it's going to be in their legislative platform. So I think there's strength in numbers. Hopefully this board can look at this and try to come up with something along the similar lines. Because I know there's going to be several, there will be an attempt to try to get some funding, hopefully in the millions of dollars in the DESE budget for this.
Thanks. Yeah, and Dr. Pollack sort of crystallized, I think, what we discussed as things that categories of funding relating to this, and that is services for students, direct services for students, counselors, therapists that we can actually come into the schools. We also talked about professional development, which is the key component of the trauma-informed Missouri model, as I see it. That costs money too, because teachers have a lot on their plate. And so if we're asking them to add to that, which it's essential that they do, especially in our school district, that costs money as well for trainers, as well as compensating them for their time. And then also just systems in place, because Steve, as you missed the conversation earlier, this is an issue in every one of our schools, and it's dozens of students in every school, some schools possibly hundreds.
Absolutely. I totally agree. There's a great need for this.
I do think it's important to note that along the same time as this bill, there was a shift though in Medicaid reimbursement allowance as well. And we, as a state, had been allowing Medicaid reimbursement for special education services that were provided to students at school sites. And about the same time as the bill, there was a shift and a Medicaid expansion to where that allowance has been made for general education students as well. And so it could be another exploration and funding in terms of that internal infrastructure for that Medicaid billing as well.
And I believe when you came and presented the board a month or so ago, you did mention that that was something that the district needs an internal structure to process that Medicaid reimbursement. Is that right?
Yes, and we are looking into it in Kansas City. We've already been in talks with Kansas City as they've been involved in some of this work already as well.
And that would be under the systems category, number 3. Well, I do like to keep the meetings to an hour, and I think we've done it. So I do want any closing thoughts from anybody, and the foundation. Feel free to jump in. We're so glad that you're here.
I do have one follow-up question for anyone really who has resources that they would be able to share. So if anyone is watching this meeting right now and hearing something that chimes with them, feeling any kind of response from something they've heard, whether that's violence they've witnessed, difficulties they're experiencing, maybe they think, I think I might be experiencing trauma, or I'm seeing that show up in my child. Are there resources that you would direct them to kind of tonight? I know we're going to talk about that at the PAC meeting tomorrow, but what can we tell people who are maybe in this exact moment thinking this might be me or my child? Where would you tell them to go, and kind of what would you direct them to do if someone is out there struggling at this moment?
So there are many crisis helplines, and I would say that it really just depends on what their presenting concern is. But behavioral health response is a great option for not only adults and caregivers, but for students of all ages. They also have a text line. So if you find yourself in crisis, needing someone to talk with tonight, BHR is a great resource. If it is something that you would like to follow up with and you believe it could wait till tomorrow morning, please feel free to reach out to your school social worker, your school counselor, your school family and community engagement specialist. They are all there ready to help. And then I am also a resource and can direct folks to individual community resources as well.
And also, in addition to that, one of the things we added this year, every school has a community resource page. And so you can always go to your school's resource page, as well as if you would go to the district's website under Student Support Services, we have a link that sets up all kinds of resources, whether it's crisis, whether it's utility assistance. We have that on the district's website. Just go to the Student Support Service tab. There's a link under there that has all the resources that you may need under that tab. And if not, you can always call the district, the parent concern office, and we will make sure we put you in contact with the right person.
I wanted to thank everyone here. One of the recent killings that we had is someone who I actually really know personally and their family. And I hear from people all the time, that this is something common. I remember myself being in high school, like not that long ago. And even now, like I have peers that are dying, left and right. And so I'm really glad that we're holding space for these conversations. And I'm really glad that we're starting to get to the root causes of, like Matt was saying earlier, the state achievement and reading and math and science. But it's so important for a district like ours that we cannot approach education in a way that a Ladue can or a Clayton can. Like we really do have to figure out how we can address some of these issues. And it's not going to just be district wide, it's going to take city collaboration. And so tomorrow we have a meeting where the Board of Aldermen will be voting on a moratorium so that we can address some of this literal bleeding that we have in the city, put things on pause so that we can address some of the literal bleeding and put a plan in place. And so just like as chair of that committee, as a 26-year-old who is like actively processing this myself, and I just really wanted to uplift that and thank you all for being here and being present and for willing to have these conversations that approach education, not just from a status quo and data and numbers population, because I think that is seriously what our scholars need from us and what we're going to have to do if we do want to improve and see them flourish.
Thank you, Alicia. I think that's a good note to close on. Absolutely. I do just want to mention that our next meeting will be on November 17th. We will be talking about students in transition, housing and security. Will follow sort of the same format. And we hope you'll join us as well. And then in December, at a date and time and location still to be determined, we'll be doing a presentation of our 3 legislative priorities, as well as our legislative platform to the community, and invite legislators, both local and the state level, and